Hello and welcome to Straight Talk Africa. I'm Vincent Makori, filling in for Shaka Sali. Today we'll look at major developments that impacted Africans in 2020 and that will set the pace for 2021. I'm joined by my guests, Emira Woods, a premier Pan-African strategist, and Kenneth Mwenda, law professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Welcome to both of you.
It's a joy to be with you in the Straight Talk.
Thank you, Vincent. Pleasure.
Thank you. We're going to talk about a number of things that really characterized what happened on the continent of Africa and how they impacted the people of the continent of Africa. I wanted us to start with the coronavirus pandemic. To begin with, let me start with Emira Woods. Would you say that for the first time, because of coronavirus, Africa found itself on same level ground with the rest of the world for the first time?
Well, Vincent, we have to first say that our hearts go out to all those who have lost family members, have lost livelihoods. It's been a global pandemic that has had global implications, not only for the impact on people's lives, but also for the impact on economies and just on well-being, mental health. All of that has been affected across the globe. So I think for many of us, we see that, in fact, pandemics do not know borders. It is all regions of the planet that were affected, some more than others. We have seen particularly those of African descent, Black and brown people around the world, whether in the US or Europe or elsewhere, Brazil, it's Black and brown people, indigenous people that have been most affected. But we also see that, perhaps there's at least a bit of a hopeful sign. Some of us are a little anxious to even voice it, because we don't want to become complacent. But at the same time, we do know that the lessons of Ebola, from my own country, from other parts of the continent that were impacted by Ebola, the lessons of HIV/AIDS and the importance of changing social behavior, but also making sure that access is available for treatment. All of those lessons are coming to bear on the continent, and so we're cautiously optimistic that, even though we do see that the numbers are going up, that these lessons will place and have placed Africa in a better footing.
As Emira points out, some say that the lessons from HIV/AIDS became very useful to African countries. We're talking about Ebola, but some still worry that not true to some extent, because again, there were some countries in Africa where there was a level of denial. What is your take on how African countries responded to the fight against coronavirus?
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Thankfully, Africa hasn't been as badly hit as part of sort of the world in the Western Hemisphere. A number of reasons have been put forward by scholars and think tanks. Largely, if you look at the population of Africa, it's generally a young population compared to the Western world. And also, this thing, when it all started, the pandemic, many coming from China to Western countries, it gave African countries an opportunity to prepare themselves. So they reacted in time to put measures to stop this. So we should give credit to a number of African countries for having taken those measures, closing borders quickly and so forth. So they learned from the experiences of other countries like Italy, for example, Spain, the UK, and so forth. So that's a big plus for the African countries. You learn from others. The other issue also is the issue of climate, the weather conditions. There's been some arguments from scientists saying that, the virus cannot survive so much in hot temperatures, sub-Saharan hot temperatures. So that has kind of played to the advantage of Africa. But all these, sort of theories that are being put across by different scientists, there's no definitive picture. But what we do know is that Africa has not been as badly hit as other parts of the world. But indeed, we can see that there are economic implications. And going into the post-COVID era, I think our prayer is that African governments should begin to prepare themselves for policies that will bring about job creation to kickstart the economies, because definitely the economic meltdown will be felt due to the impact of COVID. We're looking at a middle class, growing the middle class. We need job creation, inclusive jobs. So those are some of the strategies I think that we should be focusing on, and priority areas of investment, especially in, concerning public expenditure.
Now, Emira, would you say that the pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of African economies? We looked at the different sectors. For example, most countries are dependent on small-scale businesses, small-scale agriculture. And what happened is that with the pandemic and people being unable to conduct the small businesses, most people just were left without anything, without any source of income. So what lessons can Africans take from this, and what should happen in order to prepare the continent for any other similar situation?
Vincent, that's without a doubt, the economic implications are dramatic. And I think the biggest implication is that, our economies have been based on this sort of dependence on imports and, extraction of resources, exporting those natural resources and importing everything else, including our food in many instances, right? So I think the market disruptions that have come as a result of this pandemic, it has been devastating without a doubt for economies across the planet and especially on the continent. But perhaps the lesson there is that, we've got to begin to shift our economies to meet our needs. So first and foremost, we've got to grow our own food, right? And stop depending on importing everything. We talk in West Africa about the jollof rice competitions. Who makes the best jollof rice? And then in many instances, we're importing even our rice, right? When our farmers are actually producing even more healthy grains of rice than anywhere on the planet. So we've got to be able to use the crisis as an opportunity to shift our economies to meet the needs of our people. Bottom line, I think it is critical to say that, if we can focus on, manufacturing, as we always so well said. It's like, it is the youth of the continent that is the blessing of the continent, and creating jobs where young people are able to get involved in manufacturing goods. Again, I'm from Liberia. We have rubber, but we ship that rubber over to the US, right? Which is, a pattern that started 8 decades ago and remains in place today. Why can we not, when the world needs rubber gloves to survive, why can we not manufacture those in our countries? So this is an opportunity to say, the markets have been disrupted. The disruption can be a reset for our economies so that the economies actually meet the needs of the people for jobs, for food, for livelihoods that will actually address the incredible creativity and innovation of the continent.
Talking about resetting the economies, we're talking about a continent which most of the people are engaged in informal sector. The employment is provided by the informal sector, which was in some countries decimated by this pandemic. So how do you reset that? How do you move people from the informal sector to the formal sector and create an economy that is strong enough to survive any such a beating from a pandemic or whatever situation that may arise in the future?
Yeah, Vincent, a number of things come to play. Whenever there's a crisis, two things happen. There's fear and panic of loss of opportunity. On the other hand, a crisis can create opportunities for others. For example, digital disruption. Now we've seen universities, private universities offering courses, including public universities online, including here in the developed world. A lot of students are studying from home. We've seen opportunities of people, working remotely from home, telemarketing and so forth. Others are losing jobs. Others are getting jobs working remotely if you've got access to the digital platform. So, you can grow entrepreneurship through these innovative means. Innovation is not just about new technology, it's about exploiting technology. So we need a mindset, a change of mindset to exploit opportunities, exploit the innovations that are coming into the market. So there is scope for growth. Of course, industries such as tourism, for example, in Africa, is likely to be very much affected because of travel restrictions and so forth, and social distancing and all those things. But we got to think creatively, like my sister Emira said. It's time to rethink the sort of abandoned policies of import substitution and export promotion. We have to go back and rethink the 1970s and how we were able to hold it together. That type of economic thinking is not old economics. It's still very much applicable in the modern age.
Yeah. And of course, it only helps if the leadership takes this lesson seriously and implements real serious programs. I want us to kind of touch a bit on the health structures and infrastructure in Africa. This was the first time where no elite could hop on a plane and go to Europe for treatment. Everybody was stuck in their own countries. And yet we know the state of our health infrastructure. What did we learn? How did this, perhaps, in your assessment, in some way inspire, or did it inspire Africans to think again about setting up good health systems that can serve everybody? Emira.
Vincent, it's the underlying question. African governments decades ago made a commitment to spend 15% of their budget on health, and all have fallen far from that mark. We've got to invest in the human security. We see a lot of investment in, quite frankly, weapons of war, militarism, and all these things that destroy humanity. And I think we need to shift our mindset to really invest in human security. And it is through health systems that are public, that are available to everybody, that we will be able to withstand not only this pandemic, but future pandemics. I think we've got to also recognize, along with a formal health infrastructure, it is women across the world who hold up issues around caregiving and have borne the greatest costs. Some are in healthcare, some are doing caregiving that is unpaid, right? And so I think we've got to also understand the need to lift up these caregivers to ensure that our base of care is supported, is strengthened, is paid, and appreciated. Because ultimately, you need both the public spending to bring the infrastructure into place, and you need the people power to make sure that that infrastructure is available to all, whether they're in the most remote communities or they're in the urban centers.
Your take on the health infrastructure?
Thanks, Vincent. It's a governance issue primarily. Some of the resources that ought to be used to build our public health institutions and systems, for example, in Africa, we have issues of integrity risks, corruption, so to speak. So if we can sort of strengthen our governance systems, that would really help us to rechannel some of these resources, which are going into pockets of private individuals. Corruption is a big challenge on the continent. We cannot shy away from that, and that in turn works against creating opportunities for growth of institutions and strengthening institutions in the public health sector. So that's a big challenge, I think, going forward. We do hope that we can pay much attention to governance issues across the continent.
And actually talk about governance and corruption. It was so sad to observe that in a number of countries, money and resources that were set aside to fight the COVID-19 pandemic were stolen. In fact, in Kenya, there were people who have emerged now known as the COVID-19 billionaires. They stole money that was meant to help people, protect themselves from the pandemic. So what does that again tell us about our continent? Taking advantage of a terrible, sad situation where people are dying to enrich oneself. So, Emira, the governance issue should, how loudly can anybody speak about that? Why do those things stay the same for years and years?
All right, Vincent, I'm calling in out of Washington, right? So this issue of accountability and transparency is not an Africa issue. Let's say that clearly right up front. And right now, you've got the biggest outliers right here in Washington, D.C. Can't ignore the governance questions, right? Those are ripe and they're key and they're important. You bring about governance by increasing opportunities for citizen oversight, by increasing opportunities for independent journalists and media to do exposés, by increasing a space for democracy to actually thrive. This is how you bring the accountability, to hold people accountable, to call them out when there are transgressions, and then to make sure that there is a judiciary that prosecutes and there's a full cycle of accountability. But I think we have to also pull back to understand that, it is also the international financial institutions, again, right here in Washington, D.C., the International Monetary Fund, it also has a role to play here, because for a large part, the policies of the international financial institutions have put a damper on public sector spending, including in healthcare. So if the IMF is saying in order to get loans, you must be able to follow these austerity measures that are basically saying don't pay your healthcare workers, keep their salaries low, right? You have this impediment towards the spending that would be needed for these public sector investments, because there is a push to privatize these services. There's an economic model that says if you have private clinics and hospitals, people will pay, people will make money, and that's the future. But we recognize that cannot be a future that's viable, because it leaves out so many, not only on the African continent, but across the planet, who don't have access, who are not able to afford these kinds of
Emira, with or without some of these adjustments that are required by the Bretton Woods institutions. What is saddening, I think, for some, is to see that for the African countries, as opposed, say, to a Western nation, those resources that are being stolen are actually already borrowed resources. Those are loans, those are grants that are given out there. They would totally, be decimated as soon as they arrive, and therefore the excuse that it's because of the conditionalities that are being placed sometimes flies in the face of logic, when you know that whatever lands in these countries again gets stolen. Isn't that sad, though?
Well, it's a complex issue, but I think we've got to say that there's got to be a shift away from a notion that healthcare should be privatized to an understanding that health is a right. So it's a key. It's just a key framing of how we approach healthcare, not only in Africa, but around the world. If you say healthcare is a right, then you will have everyone from local officials to national, regional, international officials understanding that we've got to protect the right for everybody to have access. So that, it's a shift in how we, how we orient public sector services in order to protect those services. There will always be issues of graft around the world, right? This is what we're saying. Those issues will need private, independent scrutiny, right? People power saying no and standing up and shedding light on what's happening to bring accountability. That's got to go hand in hand with making sure that we're also advancing a global infrastructure that prioritizes public essential services, so that those services are available for all, whether it's for health or for education, or quite frankly, for energy.
I agree perfectly well with Emira. Corruption is a global thing. Okay, that's why we have corruption indexes done by various institutions, and even in Africa, we have a colleague from Sudan who runs the shop in London.
Oh, Ibrahim. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a global phenomenon. However, the impact of corruption in a smaller economy, you know, is much different from the impact of corruption in a bigger economy like the US, for example, okay? And look at the institutions of governance, okay, where you have strong institutions, judiciary, who are not compromised by the executive of the state. Whereas in Africa, you have autocratic systems which can actually capture the state. And it's very difficult to fight corruption in those type of environments where you have an all-powerful executive that cuts across. You know, developed countries, by contrast, yes, they have corruption, but they have relatively well-developed systems and institutions which can, you know, lead to better accountability if you pursue some of these individuals. Although not with absolute certainty, but there's a higher degree and higher probability.
Yeah. Okay. So I want us to turn to another issue in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. Also, was a big thing on the continent before we talk about other matters, how it impacted the society. You know, think about customs and practices, you know, funerals, weddings, even, you know, happy moments and even sad moments. Emira, if I may start with you.
Oh, well, this has been it's been the tragedy of our time, right? This has it's touched our lives in such profound ways. So many of us have lost family members and friends, and have not had those traditional opportunities to grieve collectively. So I think it's been incredibly painful and incredibly difficult. And so we've got to understand the toll that this is taking on us as a human family, and be sure to provide as we move forward, provide opportunities for psychosocial counseling, for caregiving, for all that's needed to kind of attend to those that will be long-term needs. I think I think many of us have learned to say goodbye on screens, and without the intimacy of being there in the last moments of family members, and that leaves scars that are long lasting. So I think we've got to recognize those scars, name them, and find ways to address them, both within our families and in our households, and within our health systems.
Indeed, it's been really sad. And Kenneth, just one word on that. Along with our inability to condole with our friends, to grieve, there was also even just the prolonged separation of families. Some of us have not seen our close families for a long time, and this had its toll, right?
Yeah, it definitely has had an impact on social ties and networks. In particular, if you look at the African, Asia, and Latin America setup, we are largely communitarian type of value systems around our families. We're not very individualistic. We like to hang out with our relatives and our cousins in large numbers. The Western world, the culture is a little bit different, of course, quite individualistic. But also, you get the younger generation, the millennials, who want to go to the beach during summertime. You can't stop them. You know, they want to have fun despite what's going on. Very energetic and that sort of thing. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's going to change drastically the way we work. A lot of us are now working remotely from home. My wife is a physician. She's a medical doctor. She works from home. We have clinicians who are also seeing patients online. The work environment has changed. The issue of shaking hands, even eating in restaurants on a dinner date, that thing is going to go for a while. It will take time before you can go out to dinner at a nice restaurant. You don't want to catch some of these diseases. So it's changed the way we do things, but more importantly, the way we work, the future of work. And Africa has to prepare for that. Yeah. ICT.
Yeah. It might take some time for people to get used to handshakes, hugs,
yes,
and whatever.
Or just using the elbow.
Exactly.
That's good enough.
I agree with all of that, especially all the issues around the future of work. I think the other issue is around women and the disproportionate impact on women. And I think you've had across, not just Africa, but across the world during this pandemic, increases in domestic violence, increases in gender-based violence. And so I think there's some real issues of pain and trauma that have resulted this year, and that need to also be recognized and acknowledged as we move forward.
And actually, I wanted to come to that now. Briefly, at the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the education system. Perhaps we'll talk about that and how lack of technology has disadvantaged a number of other kids who are perhaps in the countryside as opposed to those in the cities. That has been, I think, another issue that countries have to think so much about in order to give people equal level of education. But talking about, if we may turn now to the issue you talked about social justice and violence. In fact, somewhere in the middle of the year, there were protests across the continent. We saw protests in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and other countries for so many reasons. One was, of course, the violence against women, which increased quite a lot, and children. And of course, there were also charges of excessive force from security apparatus in many countries. So perhaps, Emira, you want to touch on that, and then we can have Kenneth also give us his take.
Oh, well, I feel like the joy of this year has been that this is a year of movements. And I think we all watched as, the horrific killing of George Floyd unfolded before our eyes. But what it ignited was a movement for justice for Black lives around the world. And to see protests from South Africa to here, Europe, throughout the world, what has come forward, I think, is an incredible just dynamism. And at the center, at the core, you have these brilliant young leaders, brilliant young people. I'm always touched when I think that the video of George Floyd would not have come to the world's eye without the poise and of this 17-year-old young woman who held that camera, held that phone to make sure that the world's gaze would not turn away. 17 years old, right? And you had also End SARS in Nigeria, young woman holding the camera to the atrocities going on and making sure that the world does not turn away. So there is something about this moment and young people using tools of creativity to demand justice that I think has been profound and will have repercussions for not just decades, but for centuries to come. I think we are at a moment of global reckoning on race because of these young leaders and what they have done. And so I think it's been incredibly difficult, right? I mean, there are countries where you've had a real clampdown by security forces in the name of COVID, right? And lockdowns and all, right? So there's a lot of really nasty violations of human rights, but there is also this dynamism of young people, this power of movements that has that's really been inspiring. And it's been global. So I want to also, I didn't mention the Africans Rising, champions that actually scaled the British Parliament to hang a banner saying rewrite history, demanding, reparations and justice, right? So it is the bold thinking of people saying, okay, we can't gather in the way that we may have before, but what else can we do? And they're pushing those boundaries. And I think there will be more of that to come because of these creative young leaders.
You're watching Straight Talk Africa. We'll be right back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa. We're looking at major developments that impacted Africans in 2020, and that will set the pace for 2021. I'm joined by my guests, Emira Woods, a premier Pan-African strategist, and Kenneth Mwenda, law professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Kenneth, given that these protests were taking place, these injustices in other places were taking place in the midst of a pandemic and many other things, we're going to talk about something else. Did they achieve much other than in Nigeria, where changes were promised? Did they achieve much, or were some of the things lost in the pandemic and people carried on thereafter to, try to survive, basically, because of the economic hardships anyway?
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Change basically happens mainly in two major forms. One, incremental, or the other, which is the radical sort of disruption. Now, the radical disruption often happens where there's a social movement, like a revolution. You expect an overnight transition. The incremental one is much of what we are seeing. We have issues, for example, and most of these issues center around socio-economic and cultural rights, second generation of human rights. What in law, we call them second generation of human rights. What we are seeing, for example, in Tigray, Ethiopia, right now, there are issues there with the authorities in Tigray against Prime Minister Ahmed's government. In Ghana, before the elections, just before the current president won elections, there were issues there, but things cooled down. Nigeria, like Emira pointed out, you move down, even in Zambia, my home country, sometimes you get a little bit of noise. They are going to elections in Zambia in August. It's a Thursday, and there are elections in Uganda, again on a Thursday. Zambia is August 2021. Uganda, it's January, in a few weeks' time, 2021. There's a lot of noise, repression of the opposition, and so forth. But these are incremental changes, and we're hoping. We are not saying that change doesn't mean there'll be a change of government. No, it could be a change of institutions, okay? The incumbent could win the elections, but at least the political discourse will change given the experience that we go through. So change is taking place, but incrementally rather than radical.
Yeah, and there were efforts to see change in a number of countries. 2020 actually became a year of elections.
Right.
We had elections in Malawi, remember, Burundi, Tanzania, Guinea, Ivory Coast, and just recently in Ghana. But one thing that stood out is that in most of those countries, there were protests. There were accusations of vote rigging, of disenfranchisement of people. And we saw governments clamp down on opposition, repression of the media. This is the year 2020. What did we learn from all this? What did it tell us about where the continent is in terms of democracy, the establishment of institutions of governance, the whole question of justice, and proper elections? Emira.
Well, I think what the lessons of 2020 is that democracy is always under assault, and we've got to, as people of conscience around the planet, we've got to fight for it. It's a continuous struggle, which we saw again here in the U.S. as well. But I think in the case of the continent, it's been a mix, right? I think many of us watched Malawi especially with just joy, because it was like, okay, maybe Ethiopia, they canceled the elections, but Malawi, they went ahead and they did it beautifully. It was people seizing their power to hold their institutions accountable, to protect democracy. And I think it is it's for me, it's extraordinary. This week we're still we're holding our breath with Ghana. For many of us, Ghana was like the shining star of democratic processes and principles and elections. And so we're waiting to see how will this all unfold, how will this all play out, because we recognize that democracy, it is not just elections, but elections are an important bellwether. So we've got to make sure that as we're protecting democracy, we're protecting those instruments for people to choose their leaders freely, to hold those leaders accountable, but we're also we're protecting democracy in its broader sense, to make sure that there is an independent judiciary, so that when there are issues that are raised, that independence of a judiciary can be, can just be a buffer that also helps to protect democracy for the future. We've got to also make sure that there is, freedom to assemble, freedom to actually, what we're seeing in places like Uganda, where, candidates being beaten up repeatedly, and so I think we've got to be able to protect opposition, protect that space, that political space for opposition voices, candidates, parties, all to be able to safely conduct electoral affairs. So, it will take all of us. It is movements. It is an independent press. It is the judiciary. It is everyone working together to protect those instruments, all of those instruments of democracy. And we know it's just much too fragile.
Yes. Now, Kenneth, all that having been said, when you consider what we witnessed, for example, in Ivory Coast, where a president went for a third term, and up to now, the opposition insists that's illegal. Where there was a situation in Tanzania where, of course, the opposition had a very difficult time. The presidential candidate had to leave to go to exile soon after the elections. We saw what happened in Guinea, for example, and people have died in those countries. So what would you say, where is the continent overall? Is there progress, or are there steps forward and then several steps back every other few years?
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Speaking as a lawyer, the challenges that we have really in constitution building, that we often do not have what we call constitutional autonomy, homegrown constitutions. We tend to borrow a lot. If you look at the Commonwealth of Africa, for example, we've borrowed heavily from a Westminster model in the UK, and then some tenets of presidentialism from the US. The US has a presidential system of government. And you have some of these countries like Nigeria, which is a federal state. Others are unitary states, okay? The problems that we are seeing, for example, in Ethiopia, where the ethnically based coalition was sort of brought under one umbrella by the incumbent prime minister. Now there's dissatisfaction from the folks who have been in power, like who've dominated politics for about the last 3 decades. It's a similar scenario you're seeing in most of these other countries, ethnic-related type of politics, rather than ideologically based and policy-based type of issues. We are seeing this even in countries like Zambia, as much as people may want to deny it. There's an element of ethnically based type of politics. Malawi was an interesting case, actually, where the incumbent at the time lost Professor Peter Mutharika. But generally speaking, what we are seeing across the board is that we are seeing more of this old style type of democracy of the big man as opposed to big institutions, but the big man type of politics. And that authoritarian type of system where you want to change the constitution. In Uganda, the constitution was amended in 1975 to allow somebody to stand for more than 2 terms. It was amended again in 2017, December, by the Ugandan parliament to allow somebody above 75 years old to continue running for politics. So these type of situations, the big old man, don't disturb the big old man. Even in the Western world, you see, Democrat, Republicans, the Republican camp was the big old man who came in power. So those things we are seeing of this, even in Europe, UK, you see this old sort of, wielding a lot of political power around him, sort of authoritarian type of things. So it's a global phenomenon, and it's spilling over to Africa as well. We are seeing that.
Although, Emira, in Africa, if you look at historically, the fellows actually who became these big old men came in as young people. So what do you make of their disdain for giving opportunities or the platform or the space to the younger generation? They typically characterize them as being inexperienced. They're not good enough. This is a place for people like me. But yet, when you look at them, most of them came into power when they were young men.
Well, that's the irony, right? I remember actually those days when when you had the Uganda, Rwanda. It was like they were and Ethiopia at the time, right? They were the new leaders of the future, right? So we remember that history, but we also see how quickly there was an effort to do things as my brother Kenneth has said to kind of change constitutions and entrench their power. So I think it is a problem with power politics that is personalized, and I think we've got to figure out how we build. Again, this is like building public institutions that are in the interest of the people. It's fundamental, because if you're coming with a sort of trickle down analysis, right, where all the money and resources and power stays within a few hands, and then you trickle down to your cronies, and then you have militaries that are protecting and maybe even a part of those cronies, right? I think it is a system that is ripe for that sort of big man, quite literally man politics, right? But I think we've got to say that there are changes underway, and one of the things I think we have to be proud of on the continent is the elements in those new constitutions where women's political leadership was lifted up. And I think we've got to continue to push for new leaders, new voices, young people to be a part of the political process, to have a sway in the institutions, because ultimately it is the power of the numbers particularly of young people that will shift these efforts to derail democracy and to entrench power for decade after decade. So I think we've got to learn from, this is I guess it's the 10th anniversary of Tunisia, and all of the changes that people power brought were not sustained, but that people power is needed to bring change and to continually push towards greater and more fundamental structural change.
Yes, and Kenneth, you're a lawyer,
Yes.
but when you observe around the continent in politics, people tend to, especially on the continent, to place a lot of goodwill in men and women and just hope for the best. And of course, amazing promises are made until the person gets to power. The formerly opposition guy who was promising everything becomes the today dictator, or with a guy with those dictatorial tendencies. What should be the priority? Should people be concerned too much about who they're going to elect, or kind of speed up the process of establishing the institutions that would protect the citizens against any excesses of the individual politician? Because all human beings have the propensity to abuse
Sure.
power, regardless of where they are.
Yeah, this is a brilliant question, an excellent question, Vincent. When we're building, for example, capital markets, the argument always comes: should we start with building stock markets or the banking sector? The money economy. Which one comes first, chicken or egg? That type of question. The biggest problem that we're facing in Africa, and what we've been facing in the last 2 decades or so, is a leadership crisis. Leadership is very, very important. It's through leadership that you're going to build these institutions. You don't expect to build good institutions with really bad leadership or poor type of leadership. So quality leadership is something that we cannot compromise over. We need to get this very clear. And a lot of people who are into politics, some of them are just about to line up their pockets. We need to look at the track record of somebody who's coming into power, where he's coming from, what he has delivered, what he has done, or where he's messed up. We cannot pretend. But we have a tendency of thinking along ethnic lines, like I alluded to earlier on, because this guy comes from the part of the country where I come from. Even if I'm a professor, I'm going to vote for him, because he's my tribesmate, he can give me a job. So that type of thinking has to change, okay? The issue of civic education as citizens, we need to be more enlightened about, these processes of electing people. So institutions, yes, they're very important. There's no doubt about it. When we're doing issues of governance, we need strong institutions, but we need leadership to provide us with a vision to build those institutions. Without good leadership, things just go to waste.
And Emira, talk about good leadership. This has to come from society at the same time. But the kind of things Kenneth is talking about need an enlightened populace and enlightened masses. So how do you achieve this? You know, it's one thing to go on the streets and protest and have placards, but it's another thing to have people having that level of awareness and kind of demand for accountability so that they can produce the leaders that they can trust and who can really and realistically kind of implement some of those great ideas.
Yeah, Vincent, that's the crux of the matter. You know, it's and I think the response is that really, you know, we've done it before, so we can do it again, right? So let's remember we've had the Lumumbas, you know, visionary leader that says, you know, basically, you know, the resources of Africa must feed the children of Africa. That means simple, basic, core values. We've had, you know, Sankara, Thomas Sankara, you know, not only did he change the name from Upper Volta, and I nearly forgot, yeah, Upper Volta to, you know, Burkina Faso, land of upright people. But he was so visionary, right? Like, this is the late 1980s, 1987 or so, right? When he was actually saying there should be parity in salaries for men and women. This is coming from Burkina Faso in the late 1980s, well before. It still hasn't happened in the United States or any, you know, many other countries around the world. But he did it, right? And was visionary on looking at climate change from then and its impact on our people and on our societies. So I think we have had these visionary leaders. And so I'm not concerned about whether or not we can create them on the continent. We've done it, right? But I think what we have had is a unfortunate shift in the balance to prioritizing those leaders that are meeting the interests of external actors, right? So Lumumba was replaced, right? We know the story well. Lumumba, you know, we need a whole show to go into all of this, yeah, but right, he was killed and he was replaced by someone who could do the bidding of the West. We know this, right? So we have had far too many examples, right? When too many are coming to mind right now of these leaders that are paying more attention to, you know, capitals in here in Washington or in Europe, you know, or these international institutions, and they're even in terms of their own people. So we've got to know that we have the capacity to do different, and we've got to demand our societies, you know, respond to that need to take a different path.
We do, Kenneth. There's a lot of mention many times of those great leaders, you know, whether it's Nelson Mandela or Lumumba, sure, Thomas Sankara. But then you see there's such a gap between some of those and any other great leader. So is there a lack of appreciation of those so that many more African leaders could be inspired and want to emulate Mandela? Why do we have to be talking about just Mandela? Why can't there be 3-4 other people who have emerged who can fit into that kind of description, or Thomas Sankara or Lumumba?
One of the biggest challenges we have is what I would call in leadership or management, even in the military, what we call ambidexterity. Yeah, we're living in the present, but to anticipate and think through for the future. We've got data, we've got facts, we've got examples, we've got precedents of good leaders, the Kenneth Kaunda, the Nyereres, the Nkurumas, but we've abandoned those facts. But, you know, so how do you project the future? How do you foresee the future? You know, living in the present doesn't mean you need not anticipate or contemplate what tomorrow will look like. You can, on the basis of the evidence and the facts of today and the past of history, be able to predict the future, but we have dropped the ball. So we have failed to replicate the type of leadership that we had at independence, the type of leaders who were selfless. You know, most of these guys, well, towards the end, some of them, they got compromised, but in the earlier stages of their tenure, they surely were very Pan-Africanist, very focused, some of them very nationalist. You're talking of the Kaundas, you're talking of the Nyereres, decent people. It's hard to find those type of leaders, not only in Africa, the world over, including in the Caribbean islands. Yes. That I can assure you.
And you know, Emira, when you look at some of those leaders you mentioned, one of the things that they had, very similar characteristics they had, was selflessness. They were not driven by getting wealthy and becoming billionaires. They were self-sacrificing. The Nyereres and all that are not known to have accumulated a lot of wealth. So some say perhaps what happens is the corruption of power, and especially how it entices people into wanting to amass wealth, and the money part of it, the wealth part of it, the materialistic part of it becomes the enemy of even the most well-intentioned leader. And that's the association of corruption with many of the bad leaders that we've witnessed across the continent.
Well, yeah, we can we can certainly discuss that. I think that there's a universal line of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that comes to mind, right? But I think we've got to see how the visionary leaders emerged. Many of them, the ones that we've mentioned here, Lumumba, came out of trade union movements, came out of a liberation struggle, right? So they shared a certain ethos, a demand for justice. They were one with the people. So I think we've got to understand what that brings, and know that we have leaders that are emerging today in these movements that are also standing with the people, that are also looking at, challenging, what racist capitalist structures, as they say so beautifully, right? It's like they're understanding these economic structures and how they have oppressed our people, and what we need to do differently, because they're walking on this road, and they're sort of with the people. So I think we've got to look to how leadership evolves, and we've got to see the leadership, through this lens of who's actually lifting up the voices of those who have been most oppressed and marginalized, and how are they doing it? And right now, I think we've got leaders that are coming out of a climate justice movement across the continent, that are saying, climate change is disastrous for the planet, but it as Nimo Basi's, one of the brilliant leaders so well says, is cooking a continent. And it is these leaders that I think we've got to lift up, as a continent and as a people, is to lift up those voices. And many of them, I have to say, they're women. They're young people that are demanding change because they understand the pain that these structures have brought in their lives, and they are at the forefront of pushing for change. And so I see it's just a different way of conceptualizing leadership that's needed, so that we're able to make sure that they are evolving in ways that they can seize political power and use that political power to lift up human dignity.
Kenneth, I wanted to just ask you one thing that could wrap up our program. Throughout the 2020, what did Africa learn, or what could Africa learn about its relationship with the global community? Because we know that, for example, so many Western countries were so focused on survival, on taking care of the economies, that they had no time or opportunity now to focus on helping the continent. So what are the lessons for the continent of Africa?
Thanks, Vincent. The ambivalence of the post-colonial African state cannot be overstated. Their governance, sort of governing class interests locally, domestically within Africa, their ruling class sort of colonial ties, Francophone Africa, you tie the French Francophone Africa ties there. We have seen the influence of what's coming through from China in terms of investment in Africa, the issues of trade barriers against exports from Africa. We've seen some of those challenges. So Africa is now caught up in the chasm between the two sort of blocks, the West and China. Then we have this coronavirus pandemic. Then we had droughts in countries like Zambia, which affected hydropower generation, electricity, for example, continuous blackouts. Agriculture sector was affected. So there are all these challenges. Then you have pockets of conflict. We have what's going on currently in Ethiopia. Hopefully that will be resolved. You go to Nigeria, Boko Haram there's a lot of noise and so forth. But above all, the greatest learning experience that I would say comes to the fore is the importance of quality leadership on the African continent. Yes, Africa is a big continent of about 53 countries. There are some examples, and I would not want to mention names because people, of course, disagree here and there, but I have a lot of admiration, for example, for President Kagame and the work that he's doing in Rwanda. Rwanda is doing exceptionally well in terms of economic growth and development and so forth. Botswana also has shown to be a very stable country over the years. So there are good lessons of experience. It's not that Africa is hopeless. There are some good examples even within Africa. We can learn. Why is Rwanda doing so well? What is it that others will say, well, Kagame is a dictator. They will come up with their own arguments. But the bottom line is the economy is growing and they're doing so well. Okay, so those are some of the issues I think that we need to think through very well. Thank you so much.
Vincent, I'm wanting to jump in because, I feel like, yeah. How has Kagame done what he's done? Clearly because he's a dictator. One, you look at the recent abduct. How do you abduct the hero from Hotel Rwanda from an airport in Dubai, and he somehow ends up, imprisoned in Kigali? Like, how do you do that? That is absolutely the best example of a repressive government that is going in absolutely the wrong direction. Not only for their own people, but then across the border. They're in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, controlling the mines, right? And getting the wealth from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so Vincent, that's a whole nother show. So don't get me started on that one, right? But I think clearly when we I think your question was about lessons. So let me refocus on that. The lessons, right? Clearly we're at a crossroads.
I fully, Emira, I'm with you. There are two schools of thought. There are two schools of thought: economic determinism versus the issue of human rights. So you're expressing the issue of human rights, but there's argument of economic determinism.
I'm saying even on the economic determination, you cannot grow your economy at the expense of your neighbors across the border whose minds you're controlling. That cannot happen. We've got to look at opportunities of doing things differently. Not, again, I'm from Liberia, where we had the history of Charles Taylor, going across the border, getting the diamonds to fuel his own interests, right? This is not sustainable, and it's not the future of the continent that we need. So we'll leave that for another show, Vincent. Yeah. But what I wanted to emphasize, I know you said the time is short, right, is that we're at a critical crossroads. It's not only this pandemic, but we know there will be future pandemics. One. Second, we are the UN tells us we have less than a decade now to avoid climate chaos. Less than a decade to basically protect the people on this planet from this devastation, as we've heard. It's like, it's the increased droughts, it's increased desertification, it's the rising sea levels in places, all of those capital cities that are along the oceans, right, that are already underwater. So we've got to recognize that as a continent and as a people, we're in a critical moment, and now is the time to kind of to seize the opportunities.
Thank you very much, Emira. You get the last word there. And on that note, our distinguished guests are Emira Woods and Kenneth Mwenda. And thanks to our audience for tuning in to Straight Talk Africa. Have a good evening.